Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The Violinist's Last Note, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, and tonight I bring you a tale that begins with the most haunting of sounds, a violin's cry cut short by death itself. Chapter 1. The Final Crescendo. The Royal Opera House stood magnificent that October evening, its golden interior bathed in warm light as London's elite gathered for what would become an unforgettable performance. Madame Céleste Fontaine, the celebrated French violinist, was to perform Paganini's Caprice No. 24, a piece notorious for its technical demands and emotional intensity. At 62, Céleste remained a force of nature. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her emerald gown caught the stage lights as she took her position centre stage. The audience held its collective breath as she raised her bow, a magnificent tutu worth more than most people's homes. The performance was flawless. Each note soared through the theatre with precision and passion that only a master could achieve. The violin seemed to sing of love, loss, and the bitter-sweet nature of life itself. As she approached the final movement, the audience was completely under her spell. But something was wrong. A keen observer might have noticed the subtle tension in Céleste's shoulders, the way her left hand trembled slightly on the fingerboard. Her breathing, visible in the rise and fall of her chest, seemed more laboured than the music demanded. Yet she played on, determined to finish what would become her swan song. The encore piece, a delicate arrangement of Debussy's Clair de Lune, began with ethereal beauty. The first few bars floated through the theatre like moonbeams on water. Then, at measure 37, something extraordinary happened. Céleste's bow seemed to falter, producing a note that wavered and died. She swayed, her free hand clutching at her throat, her eyes wide with sudden terror. The violin fell first, clattering to the stage floor with a discordant crash that made the audience gasp. Then Céleste herself collapsed, her emerald gown spreading around her like spilled paint. The bow rolled across the polished wood, coming to rest near the music stand, where her sheet music fluttered in the theatre's ventilation. Pandemonium erupted. Someone screamed, others rushed forward. The house lights blazed to life, harsh and revealing. In the sudden illumination, one could see Céleste's face pale, her lips tinged with an alarming blue hue, her eyes staring sightlessly at the ornate ceiling above. Dr. Hartwell, a prominent physician who had been enjoying the concert from the third row, immediately took charge. He knelt beside the fallen artist, checking for a pulse that was already fading. His trained nose detected something that made him frown, a faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds. "Clear the stage," he commanded. "Someone call for an ambulance, though I fear it may be too late." Among the chaos, a small Belgian gentleman with an impressive moustache sat quietly in his box seat, his green eyes taking in every detail. While others focused on the tragic figure of Céleste, his attention was drawn to other elements. The music stand with its scattered sheets, the violin with its strings still quivering, the rosin dust that seemed oddly distributed on the stage floor. The Belgian gentleman, though few in the audience would have recognized the famous detective, noticed things others missed. The way Céleste's bow hand had been positioned when she fell, the fact that her music sheets seemed to have pages missing, the strange expression on the face of her accompanist, who sat frozen at the piano bench. As the authorities arrived and began their preliminary investigation, the detective's mind was already working. This was no simple case of an aging artist succumbing to the pressures of performance. The bitter almond scent suggested cyanide poisoning. But how had it been administered? And why during the encore, when she had played the main piece flawlessly? The music stand drew his attention again. Something about the arrangement of the sheets seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if the killer had left a message written in musical notation, a deadly composition that only the most observant eye would detect. The Royal Opera House, once filled with the sublime beauty of Céleste's music, now resonated with whispered conversations, official questions, and the heavy footsteps of investigators. The stage, where art had triumphed, now bore witness to a more sinister performance, one where the final curtain had fallen, not on applause, but on murder. As the evening wore on, it became clear that Madame Celeste Fontaine's last performance would be remembered not for its beauty, but for the mystery that surrounded her final haunting note. The investigation was about to begin, and somewhere in that elegant theatre, a killer walked among the mourners, believing their perfect crime had gone unnoticed. But they had not counted on the small Belgian gentleman with the impressive moustache, whose reputation for solving the most perplexing murders preceded him wherever he went. Chapter 2. Discordant Clues. The morning after Celeste's tragic death brought a grey London dawn that seemed to reflect the sombre mood at the Royal Opera House. Police had cordoned off the building, and Detective Inspector Morrison of Scotland Yard found himself facing what appeared to be an impossible puzzle. The Belgian detective, having introduced himself to the inspector as a concerned observer with some experience in these matters, was granted permission to examine the scene. His methodical approach impressed Morrison, who had heard whispers of the Belgian's reputation for unravelling the most complex cases. The preliminary examination confirmed cyanide poisoning, Morrison explained as they stood on the empty stage. But how it was administered remains a complete mystery. She had no food or drink during the performance, and her water bottle backstage tested negative. The detective knelt beside the music stand, his keen eyes studying the scattered sheets. "Ah, but observe, mon ami, these pages, they are not in the correct order. Someone has deliberately rearranged them." He picked up one of the sheets with his handkerchief, noting the slight discoloration along the edges. "See here, this page has been handled differently from the others. The paper shows signs of moisture, perhaps from nervous hands." Moving to where the violin lay in its open case, the police having finally allowed its removal, the detective noticed something that had escaped everyone else's attention. One of the tuning pegs was slightly bent, barely perceptible to the untrained eye. "This instrument is worth perhaps £200,000, he murmured, running his fingers carefully around the edge of the case. A violinist of Madame Fontaine's calibre would notice immediately if anything were amiss with her instrument, yet she played beautifully until the very end. Dr. Hartwell approached them, his medical bag in hand. "I've completed my preliminary examination of the body." The cyanide acted quickly but not instantly. She would have felt the first effects during those final measures. The difficulty breathing, the dizziness. It's remarkable she managed to continue playing at all. And yet she did, the detective mused, which suggests she may not have immediately recognized what was happening to her. "Tell me, doctor, how long between the first symptoms and collapse?" "Perhaps 3 to 4 minutes. The dose was substantial but not immediately lethal. Someone wanted her to suffer, to realize what was happening." The Belgian detective's moustache twitched thoughtfully. "Or perhaps they wanted her to finish the performance first. But why? What was so important about those final notes?" He returned to the music sheets, this time examining them more carefully under a magnifying glass he produced from his waistcoat pocket. "Fascinating. Look here, someone has made pencil marks on this page, very faint, almost invisible unless one knows what to look for." Inspector Morrison leaned closer. "I don't see anything." Precisely why they went unnoticed, but held at this angle. He tilted the page toward the stage lights. "Numbers. Someone has written a sequence of numbers in the margins, 4, 7, 12, 15. "Could be measure numbers," Dr. Hartwell suggested. "Perhaps, but why these particular measures?" The detective hummed softly as he studied the notation. The piece was Clair de Lune, a beautiful but relatively simple arrangement, yet someone felt compelled to mark specific passages. They were interrupted by the arrival of a striking woman in her 30s, her auburn hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. She introduced herself as Victoria Sterling, Celeste's manager and closest friend. "I still can't believe she's gone," Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled. Celeste was in perfect health. She had a medical examination just last month for her insurance policy. Everything was normal. "Tell me about her routine before performances," the detective requested gently. "Always the same. She would arrive 2 hours early, tune her violin herself, never trusted anyone else to do it properly, and run through the most difficult passages." She was incredibly particular about her rosin, Victoria's voice caught slightly. "She had this special blend made by an artisan in Paris. Said it gave her better control of the bow." The detective's eyes sharpened. This rosin, where is it kept? In her dressing room, with all her accessories. She never let it out of her sight during performance days. They made their way backstage to Celeste's dressing room, a cosy space filled with flowers from admirers and photographs from her long career. On the vanity table sat an elegant wooden box containing various violin accessories, extra strings, several cakes of rosin, and 2 spare bows. The detective examined the rosin cakes carefully, noting that one appeared to have been handled more recently than the others. This one. It has been used very recently. See the fine dust on the surface, but look more closely. Under his magnifying glass, the rosin revealed its secret. Mixed within the amber-coloured resin were tiny flecks of something else, something that caught the light differently. "Inspector Morrison," the detective said quietly, "I believe we may have found our delivery method. This rosin has been contaminated with something, probably ground glass, to create tiny cuts on the fingers, then treated with a slow-acting poison that would be absorbed through the skin during the performance." Victoria gasped. "But that's impossible. Celeste always handled her own rosin. No one else ever touched it." "Exactly," the detective replied, his green eyes reflecting a deep sadness. "Which means our killer is someone Celeste trusted completely, someone who had access to her most precious possessions, someone who knew her habits intimately." The web of deception was beginning to reveal itself, and the detective realized they were dealing with a murderer who had planned this crime with meticulous attention to detail. The music itself had been part of the murder weapon, and somewhere among the mourners and well-wishers, a cold-blooded killer was watching their careful plan unfold. Chapter 3. The Orchestra of Suspects. By afternoon, the Royal Opera House had taken on the atmosphere of a crime scene, rather than a temple to the arts. The Belgian detective, now working closely with Inspector Morrison, had requested interviews with everyone who had been backstage or had close contact with Celeste Fontaine in the days leading up to her final performance. The first to be questioned was James Whitmore, Celeste's longtime accompanist, a man in his 50s with prematurely grey hair and nervous habits. He had been with Celeste for nearly 15 years. His hands shook as he sat in the small office that had been converted into an interview room. "She was everything to me," Whitmore said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not romantically, you understand. She was far too sophisticated for someone like me, but musically we were perfectly matched. She trusted me completely." The detective observed the man's genuinely distraught demeanour. "You had access to her dressing room?" "Of course. We would often go over difficult passages together. She would ask me to play certain sections while she worked on her fingering." Whitmore's eyes filled with tears. "She was a perfectionist. Every performance had to be flawless." "Did you notice anything unusual about her behaviour in recent weeks?" Whitmore considered this carefully. She had been receiving strange letters. Fan mail mostly, but some of it was disturbing. People become obsessed with artists, you know. She usually threw them away, but lately she seemed more bothered by them. This information was filed away as potentially significant. The detective made a mental note to examine Celeste's correspondence more thoroughly. Next came Dr. Elena Vasquez, a younger violinist who had been studying with Celeste. At 32, Elena possessed considerable talent, but lacked the international recognition that had made Celeste famous. She sat with perfect posture, her dark hair pulled back severely, her expression carefully neutral. Madame Fontaine was a demanding teacher, Elena admitted, when pressed about their relationship. She expected perfection from everyone, especially her students. I had been hoping she would recommend me for the Berlin Philharmonic auditions next month. "And would she have made that recommendation?" the detective asked gently. Elena's composure cracked slightly. "I don't know. She had been increasingly critical of my technique lately. She said I lacked the emotional depth necessary for truly great music." The detective noted the bitterness in her voice, the way her hands clenched when she spoke of her teacher's criticism. Eleanor certainly had access to Celeste's dressing room and would have known about her habits with the rosin. The third suspect proved even more intriguing. Marcus Chen, the theatre's stage manager, had worked at the Royal Opera House for over 20 years. His knowledge of the building's every corner and his responsibility for the technical aspects of each performance gave him unique access to areas others might not enter. Madame Fontaine could be difficult, Marcus said diplomatically. She had very specific requirements for lighting, temperature, even the positioning of her music stand. Last week she had me measure the exact distance from her usual spot to the piano. Twice. She was convinced something was different. Different how? She claimed the acoustics had changed, said someone had been moving things in the theatre, that her sound wasn't carrying the same way. Marcus shrugged. I couldn't hear any difference, but artists can be particular about these things. The detective found this detail fascinating. Had Celeste noticed someone tampering with the stage area? Was her heightened awareness a sign that she suspected something was wrong? The most surprising interview came with Sir Reginald Ashworth, the theatre's elderly benefactor and board chairman. At 75, Sir Reginald had been instrumental in bringing Celeste to London for regular performances. His relationship with the violinist went back nearly a decade. She was more than just a performer to me, Sir Reginald admitted, his voice heavy with grief. Celeste brought culture and refinement to this city. She was a dear friend. The detective's trained eye caught something in the old man's tone, a hesitation that suggested deeper feelings than mere friendship. How dear a friend, if I may ask? Sir Reginald's pale cheeks flushed. I had hoped that perhaps in time our relationship might have become something more personal. I'd even asked her to dinner several times, but she always maintained professional boundaries. And how did you feel about those boundaries? Disappointed, naturally, but I respected her wishes. Celeste was a woman of principle. He paused, then added quietly, though I had hoped that eventually. Another potential motive emerged. Unrequited love had driven many to desperate acts, and Sir Reginald's position gave him access to virtually every area of the theatre. As the interviews concluded, the detective found himself with more questions than answers. Each suspect had motive, means and opportunity. Elena's professional jealousy, Marcus's daily access to the theatre, Sir Reginald's unrequited feelings, even Victoria's position as manager, giving her intimate knowledge of Celeste's habits. But one detail nagged at him, the mysterious numbers found on the music sheet. 4, 7, 12, 15. They seemed too deliberate to be random, too specific to be accidental. As he stood on the empty stage that evening, the detective hummed Debussy's Clair de Lune, counting measures as he went. At measure 4, the melody introduced its main theme. At 7, a subtle harmonic shift. At 12, the beginning of the most technically challenging passage. And at 15, the music reached its emotional climax before beginning its descent toward the peaceful conclusion. But Celeste had collapsed at measure 37, long after these marked passages. What had the killer been trying to tell her? Or had those numbers served an entirely different purpose? Perhaps marking not musical moments, but something far more sinister. The answers lay hidden somewhere in the complex web of relationships surrounding the brilliant violinist, and the detective knew that tomorrow would bring new revelations in this deadly symphony of murder. Chapter 4. Poison Strings. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Inspector Morrison arrived at the detective's hotel with a grim expression and a manila envelope under his arm. The autopsy results, he announced, settling into the comfortable chair by the window. Dr. Patterson found something interesting. The cyanide levels in Madame Fontaine's system suggest the poison was administered over several hours, not all at once. The Belgian detective set down his morning coffee, his interest immediately piqued. Ah, so our killer was more subtle than we first believed. This was not a single, massive dose, but rather a gradual poisoning. Exactly. Small amounts absorbed through the skin, probably beginning several hours before the performance. The final collapse was simply when the accumulated poison reached a lethal level. This revelation changed everything. The detective had been focusing on the moments immediately before Celeste's collapse, but now it became clear that the murder had begun much earlier in the day. We must examine everything she touched that day, the detective mused. Every surface, every object. The rosin was certainly involved, but there may have been other sources as well. Their investigation led them back to Celeste's London apartment, an elegant flat in Mayfair furnished with antiques and filled with memorabilia from her illustrious career. Victoria Sterling met them there, her eyes red from crying, but her manner still professionally composed. She was here all morning practicing, Victoria explained as they entered the music room. I arrived around 11 to go over the final details for the evening's performance. She seemed in perfect health then, perhaps a bit more focused than usual, but that was normal before an important concert. The detective examined the music room with his characteristic thoroughness. A beautiful Steinway grand piano dominated the space, with a music stand positioned precisely where Celeste would have practiced. Sheet music was scattered across the piano bench, and on a small table nearby sat her practice violin, a less valuable instrument she used for daily work. She would never risk her Guarneri for practice, Victoria explained. That violin only came out for performances. The detective picked up the practice violin, noting immediately that its strings seemed unusually loose. When did she last tune this instrument? Yesterday morning, I believe. She was very particular about tuning. Said a properly tuned violin was like a properly tuned mind, essential for clear thinking. But these strings were far from properly tuned. In fact, they seem to have been deliberately loosened. The detective examined the tuning pegs more closely and found minute scratches around their bases, signs that someone had been adjusting them recently. Victoria, did anyone else visit Madame Fontaine yesterday? Any unexpected guests? Well, Elena came by in the afternoon for her lesson, and Marcus stopped by to confirm some staging details. Oh, and Sir Reginald sent flowers, those roses on the mantelpiece. The detective turned his attention to the magnificent white roses, their petals beginning to droop slightly. He leaned closer, inhaling the fragrance, then froze. Beneath the sweet scent of roses was another smell, faint but unmistakable to his trained senses. Inspector Morrison, do you smell that? Morrison sniffed the flowers carefully. Just roses to me. Ah, but there is something else, very subtle, but present. The detective carefully examined the water in the crystal vase. This water, it has been treated with something. See how it has a slightly oily consistency, and this faint chemical odour. Using a small testing kit he kept in his jacket, the detective confirmed his suspicion. Traces of a chemical compound that, when absorbed through the skin, would cause gradual cyanide poisoning. Victoria gasped. But that means, Sir Reginald, let us not jump to conclusions. Anyone could have tampered with these flowers after they were delivered. When exactly did they arrive? Around 10 in the morning. Sir Reginald's driver brought them personally. The detective made careful notes, then continued his examination of the apartment. In the bathroom he found Celeste's hand cream, partially used. On the kitchen counter, her coffee cup from the morning still sat unwashed. Each item was carefully tested and catalogued, but it was in the bedroom that he made the most significant discovery. On Celeste's vanity table, among her jewellery and cosmetics, sat a small music box, an exquisite piece decorated with mother-of-pearl and gold filigree. When opened, it played a delicate melody while a tiny ballerina spun on a spring mechanism. "This is beautiful," the detective observed, examining the intricate mechanism. "When did Madame Fontaine acquire it?" "It was a gift from a secret admirer about a month ago," Victoria replied. "She found it on her dressing-room table one evening after a performance. There was no note, but she was charmed by it." The detective's fingers traced the edges of the music box, finding what he was looking for, a tiny hidden compartment in the base, accessible only if one knew exactly where to press. Inside was a small vial, empty, but still bearing traces of a clear liquid. "Our killer has been planning this for weeks," he said grimly. "This music box was designed to deliver small doses of poison each time Madame Fontaine opened it. Combined with the treated flowers, the tampered rosin, and possibly other sources we have yet to discover, it created a perfect gradual poisoning." Inspector Morrison whistled low. "But that level of planning, that attention to detail, this isn't a crime of passion. This is cold-blooded murder." The detective nodded gravely. "Indeed, and our killer has been very careful to ensure that suspicion would fall on multiple people. Elena had access during her lesson, Marcus during his visit, Sir Reginald through his flowers. Even Victoria, as Madame Fontaine's manager, had ample opportunity. But as they prepared to leave the apartment, the detective noticed one final detail that troubled him. On Celeste's desk was a half-written letter, apparently begun that morning, but never finished. The opening words were visible. "My dearest friend, I must tell you of my growing suspicions." The letter ended there. The pen dropped as if Celeste had been interrupted. Had she begun to realize what was happening to her? Had she started to identify her killer? And if so, why hadn't she finished the letter or called for help? The answer to those questions, the detective realized, might very well reveal the identity of the murderer who had orchestrated this elaborate and deadly symphony. Chapter 5. Secrets in Minor Keys. The unfinished letter haunted the detective's thoughts as he made his way through London's evening fog to his next appointment. He had arranged to meet with Dr. Hartwell at the physician's private practice, hoping the medical man might provide additional insights into the complex poisoning. Dr. Hartwell's office was a testament to his successful career. Mahogany furniture, leather-bound medical texts, and certificates from prestigious institutions adorned the walls. The doctor himself appeared tired. The events of recent days clearly weighed on him. "I've been thinking about the gradual nature of the poisoning," Dr. Hartwell began without preamble. "It's remarkably sophisticated. Whoever did this understood not only chemistry, but also human physiology. They knew exactly how much poison to administer, and over what time frame, to achieve maximum effect while minimizing early detection." The detective leaned forward in his chair. "You sound as though you suspect someone with medical knowledge. Not necessarily a doctor, but certainly someone with advanced understanding of pharmacology and toxicology. This wasn't just about killing Madame Fontaine. It was about making her suffer while maintaining her ability to perform until the very end." This observation aligned with the detective's growing certainty that the murder was deeply personal, driven by something more complex than simple greed or professional jealousy. "Doctor, I must ask you something in confidence. Had you met Madame Fontaine before that tragic evening?" Dr. Hartwell's expression grew uncomfortable. "Actually, yes. She had consulted me professionally several times over the past few months. She had been experiencing some unusual symptoms: fatigue, occasional dizziness, slight tremors in her left hand. Nothing that would prevent her from performing, but enough to concern her." "And your diagnosis?" "I could find nothing wrong. Her blood work was normal, her heart strong. I suggested the symptoms might be stress-related, perhaps connected to the pressures of her career. She was approaching retirement age, after all, and that can be psychologically challenging for an artist of her caliber." The detective's moustache twitched thoughtfully. "But now, with what we know about the gradual poisoning—" "Exactly. Those symptoms were likely early signs of chronic low-level cyanide exposure. Someone had been slowly poisoning her for months, perhaps even longer." This revelation cast the entire case in a new light. The murder hadn't begun with the concert preparations. It had been a long, methodical process, extending far back in time. Later that evening, the detective sat in his hotel room surrounded by notes, evidence, and photographs. The case was becoming increasingly complex, with layers of deception that seemed to extend in every direction. He had asked Inspector Morrison to arrange for a complete forensic examination of Celeste's apartment, but he suspected they would find evidence of poisoning in numerous objects and locations. A knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. Victoria Sterling stood in the hallway, her usual composure replaced by visible distress. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late," she said, "but I've remembered something that might be important, about that unfinished letter." The detective invited her in and offered her a chair by the fireplace. Victoria accepted gratefully, her hands trembling slightly as she began to speak. "I knew Celeste was writing to someone regularly over the past few weeks. She would spend hours at her desk, then tear up what she had written and start again. When I asked her about it, she said she was trying to find the right words to tell someone something very difficult." "Did she give any indication who this correspondent might be?" "That's what I've been trying to remember. Last week she mentioned something about betrayal. She said, 'It's always the people closest to you who can hurt you the most.' I thought she was speaking philosophically, but now—" Victoria paused, seeming to struggle with some internal conflict. "There's something else, something I haven't told anyone because I wasn't sure it was relevant. About 6 months ago, Celeste came to me very upset. She had discovered that someone had been embezzling from her accounts. Small amounts over a long period, done very carefully to avoid detection. She asked me to investigate quietly without involving the authorities. And did you discover the identity of this embezzler? Victoria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Yes, it was someone she trusted completely, someone who had been managing certain aspects of her finances for years. She was devastated, not by the money itself, but by the betrayal. Who was it, Victoria? But before she could answer, the lights in the hotel room suddenly went out. In the darkness, the detective heard Victoria gasp, followed by the sound of running footsteps in the corridor outside. When he managed to restore the lights moments later, Victoria was gone. The detective immediately called Inspector Morrison, reporting the strange incident. A search of the hotel and surrounding area revealed no trace of Victoria Sterling. It was as if she had vanished into the London fog. But on the chair where she had been sitting, the detective found a small piece of paper, apparently dropped in the confusion. On it was written a single word in Victoria's handwriting: James. Whitmore, the accompanist, the man who had claimed to love Celeste like a devoted friend, the man who had worked with her for 15 years, who had access to her dressing room, who knew her habits better than anyone. But if James was the embezzler, and if Celeste had discovered his theft, why hadn't she confronted him directly? Why the gradual poisoning rather than a direct confrontation or legal action? The detective realized that Victoria's disappearance might not be coincidental. Perhaps she had remembered more than she had initially revealed, and perhaps that knowledge had put her in danger. As he prepared for what he sensed would be a crucial next day in the investigation, the detective couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple case of murder for financial gain. The careful orchestration of Celeste's death, the symbolic use of her own music as part of the murder method, suggested someone driven by deep emotional wounds and a desire for elaborate revenge. Tomorrow, he decided, it would be time to confront James Whitmore directly. Chapter 6. The Accompanist's Confession. The morning brought disturbing news. Victoria Sterling's body had been found in the Thames, apparently having fallen from Westminster Bridge during the night. Inspector Morrison's grim expression told the detective everything he needed to know. They were now dealing with 2 murders, and their investigation had clearly gotten too close to the truth. The preliminary examination suggests she was pushed, Morrison reported. No signs of suicide, and several witnesses reported seeing a struggle on the bridge around midnight. The detective studied the crime scene photographs with growing certainty that Victoria's death was connected to what she had been about to reveal about James Whitmore. The embezzlement discovery had been the trigger for Celeste's murder, and Victoria's knowledge of that secret had sealed her fate as well. They found James Whitmore at his modest flat in Bloomsbury, a cramped space filled with sheet music and dominated by an upright piano that had seen better days. The accompanist looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days, and his hands shook more visibly than they had during his initial interview. "We need to discuss your relationship with Madame Fontaine," the detective began gently, settling into a worn armchair. "Specifically the financial aspects of that relationship." James's reaction was immediate and telling. His face went pale, and he sank onto his piano bench as if his legs could no longer support him. "I never meant for it to go this far," he whispered. "It started so small, just borrowing what I thought she would never miss. I was going to pay it back. I swear I was." Inspector Morrison stepped forward. "James Whitmore, I am arresting you for the murder of Celeste Fontaine and Victoria Sterling." "No!" James cried out, his voice breaking. "I stole from her, yes, but I didn't kill anyone. I loved Celeste. She was everything to me." The detective held up a hand, stopping Morrison's formal arrest. Something in James's desperation rang true, and his years of experience had taught him to listen carefully to such moments. "Tell us about the embezzlement," the detective said quietly. "When did it begin? And why?" James buried his face in his hands. 3 years ago. My mother was dying of cancer, and the treatments weren't covered by insurance. I was desperate. Celeste paid me well, but not enough to cover the medical bills. I knew she had so much money, accounts she rarely looked at. "So you began taking small amounts?" "Just a few £100 at first, from her petty cash accounts, then larger amounts from her investment returns. I was careful, spread it across multiple accounts, made it look like legitimate expenses. James looked up, tears in his eyes. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd replace everything once my mother's treatments were finished. But your mother died anyway. James nodded miserably. 6 months ago. And by then I had taken nearly £50,000. I didn't know how to stop, how to explain, how to make it right. The detective leaned forward. When did Madame Fontaine discover what you'd been doing? About 2 months ago. She confronted me in her dressing room after a rehearsal. She had noticed some discrepancies and had hired a private accountant to investigate. James's voice became barely audible. She was so disappointed in me. Not angry, just heartbroken. What did she say to you? That she had trusted me completely, and that my betrayal hurt more than any professional slight or bad review ever could. She said she needed time to decide what to do about it. Inspector Morrison exchanged glances with the detective. This timeline aligned with Dr. Hartwell's observation about Celeste's stress-related symptoms beginning several months earlier. Did she threaten to expose you? To have you arrested? No, that was the worst part. She said she understood why I had done it, that desperation could drive people to terrible choices. She offered to help me get proper legal representation and work out a repayment plan. James looked up, anguish written across his features. She was going to save my career, my reputation, everything, even after what I had done to her. The detective studied James carefully. The man's grief and remorse appeared genuine, but something still didn't fit properly. James, if Madame Fontaine was willing to help you, if she was showing you mercy rather than seeking punishment, why would you kill her? I didn't, James protested. I would never hurt her. Yes, I was terrified about the scandal, about my career being ruined. But Celeste was offering me a way out. Why would I throw that away? And Victoria Sterling, what was your relationship with her? James' expression grew confused. Victoria? We barely knew each other. She handled Celeste's bookings and publicity. I dealt with the musical arrangements. We might have exchanged a few dozen words over the years. The detective began to sense that their investigation had taken a wrong turn. James's emotional responses seemed too genuine to be fabricated, and his account of Celeste's merciful reaction rang true with what they knew of the violinist's character. James, I want you to think very carefully. In the weeks before Madame Fontaine's death, did you notice anyone else showing unusual interest in her affairs? Anyone asking questions about her routines, her habits, her relationships? James wiped his eyes and considered the question. Well, there was Eleanor. She had been asking me about Celeste's teaching methods, about how to gain her approval, but that seemed natural enough. Eleanor was desperate for Celeste's recommendation. Anyone else? Sir Reginald had been more attentive lately, always finding excuses to visit backstage, asking about Celeste's health, her mood. I thought he was just, well, you know how older gentlemen can become infatuated. The detective made careful notes. Both Eleanor and Sir Reginald remained viable suspects, but something still nagged at him, the sophistication of the poisoning scheme, the intimate knowledge of Celeste's habits, the access to her personal belongings. It all suggested someone much closer to the victim than either of those suspects. James, you mentioned that Victoria rarely interacted with you directly, but she would have had complete access to Madame Fontaine's financial records, wouldn't she? Of course. Victoria managed everything, contracts, payments, investments. She probably knew Celeste's financial situation better than Celeste herself. A terrible possibility began to form in the detective's mind. Victoria had claimed to have discovered James's embezzlement at Celeste's request, but what if the truth was more complex? What if Victoria had been covering for someone else? Or worse, what if she had been involved in the theft herself? Inspector Morrison, the detective said quietly, I believe we need to examine Victoria Sterling's financial records very carefully, and perhaps we should reconsider the timing of her death. As they prepared to leave James's apartment, the detective noticed something that made him pause. On the piano was a photograph of James with Celeste, taken at what appeared to be a small private party, but in the background of the photo, partially obscured but still visible, was another figure, someone whose presence at such a gathering suggested a much closer relationship with Celeste than they had previously admitted. The detective pointed to the figure in the photograph. "James, who is this person in the background?" James squinted at the photo. "Oh, that's Dr. Hartwell. This was taken at Celeste's birthday party last year. He and Celeste had become quite close friends. She consulted him regularly about her health concerns." Dr. Hartwell, the physician who had been conveniently present at the concert, who had quickly diagnosed the cyanide poisoning, who had detailed knowledge of how such poisons worked, the man who had treated Celeste for the mysterious symptoms that they now knew were early signs of chronic poisoning. But Dr. Hartwell had seemed genuinely concerned about Celeste's welfare, and his medical expertise had been crucial in understanding the nature of the poisoning. Could he really be capable of such an elaborate deception? As they left James's apartment, the detective's mind was racing. The case was far from solved, and Victoria's death had eliminated a crucial witness. But new patterns were emerging, new connections that suggested the truth was more complex and more disturbing than any of them had initially imagined. The afternoon would bring new revelations, new questions, and perhaps, finally, some answers to the mystery of who had orchestrated Celeste Fontaine's deadly final performance. Chapter 7. The Doctor's Prescription. The detective's suspicions about Dr. Hartwell solidified as they delved deeper into the physician's background. A visit to the General Medical Council revealed troubling information about the doctor's recent professional history. 3 complaints filed against him in the past 18 months, Inspector Morrison read from the official records. 2 for inappropriate personal relationships with patients, 1 for prescribing medications without proper justification. They sat in Morrison's office at Scotland Yard, surrounded by files and evidence boxes from both murders. The detective studied the timeline they had constructed on the whiteboard, noting how Dr. Hartwell's involvement with Celeste coincided perfectly with the beginning of her mysterious symptoms. "The complaints were ultimately dismissed," Morrison continued, "but they suggest a pattern of boundary violations. And look at this. One of the complainants was a female musician, a pianist, who claimed Dr. Hartwell had become obsessively involved in her personal life." The detective's green eyes reflected his growing certainty. A man with medical knowledge, access to poisons, and a history of inappropriate relationships with patients, and he was conveniently present at the concert to discover the poisoning. Their investigation of Dr. Hartwell's private practice revealed even more damning evidence. Hidden in a locked filing cabinet, they found detailed medical records on Celeste Fontaine, far more extensive than would be normal for a physician treating minor symptoms. The files contained photographs of Celeste taken without her knowledge, detailed notes about her daily routines, and, most disturbing of all, a carefully planned poisoning schedule that matched exactly with the timeline of her declining health. "Listen to this," Morrison said, reading from one of the doctor's notes. "Subject continues to trust me completely despite increasing symptoms. The gradual approach is working perfectly. She attributes her declining stamina to natural aging rather than external causes." But it was the final entry that revealed the true depth of Dr. Hartwell's obsession. "She has become suspicious and has begun asking questions about her symptoms. I fear she may consult another physician. The timeline must be accelerated. The concert on Thursday will provide the perfect opportunity for the final act." The detective felt a chill as he read those words. Dr. Hartwell hadn't just been poisoning Celeste. He had been documenting her slow death like a clinical study, treating her murder as a medical experiment. "But why?" Morrison asked. "What was his motive for such an elaborate killing?" The answer came in the form of a hidden compartment in the doctor's desk, containing a collection of letters written to Celeste but never sent. The letters revealed a man consumed by unrequited love, convinced that Celeste would eventually return his feelings if only he could eliminate the obstacles in her life. The letters detailed his growing jealousy of everyone close to Celeste: James Whitmore for his musical partnership, Elena Vasquez for representing the next generation of talent, Sir Reginald for his wealth and social position. But most of all, he resented Victoria Sterling for her role as Celeste's closest confidant and protector. He saw Victoria as the primary barrier to winning Celeste's affection. The detective explained as they read through the correspondence. These letters make it clear that he believed Celeste would have turned to him for comfort and support if Victoria hadn't been poisoning her mind against romantic involvement. The final letter in the collection was dated just 3 days before Celeste's death. "My darling Celeste, soon you will be free of all the people who have kept us apart. Victoria suspects something, but she won't be able to interfere much longer. After Thursday, there will be only grief, and I will be there to comfort you through it all." Morrison looked up from the letter with disgust. He was planning to kill Victoria from the beginning. Indeed, Victoria's death wasn't a desperate response to our investigation. It was always part of his plan. He intended to console Celeste through the grief of losing her closest friend, positioning himself as her only source of support. But the detective realized there was still one crucial element missing from their understanding of the case. Dr. Hartwell's plan had called for Celeste to survive the concert, to live on in grief and isolation until she turned to him for comfort. The fatal dose of poison at the Royal Opera House hadn't been part of his original scheme. Something went wrong, the detective mused. The doctor's plan was to incapacitate Celeste gradually, to make her dependent on him while eliminating the people around her. The deadly dose at the concert suggests either a miscalculation or a change in plans. They found their answer in Dr. Hartwell's appointment book. On the day of Celeste's final performance, he had scheduled an emergency meeting with someone whose identity was recorded only as V. Victoria Sterling, Morrison concluded. Victoria must have confronted him. Perhaps she had discovered his involvement in the poisoning scheme. The detective nodded grimly, and when she threatened to expose him, he decided to accelerate his timeline. Better to have Celeste dead than to risk losing her entirely to scandal and criminal prosecution. As evening fell, they prepared to arrest Dr. Hartwell at his home in Hampstead. But when they arrived at his elegant Georgian townhouse, they found only an empty house and a note addressed to "My dear detective." The note was brief, but chilling. "By the time you read this, I will have joined my beloved Celeste in whatever realm awaits us. If I could not have her love in life, perhaps I can earn her forgiveness in death. The music box in her bedroom contains everything you need to understand. I regret only that Victoria had to suffer for her interference." A search of the house revealed Dr. Hartwell's body in his study, dead from the same cyanide compound he had used to poison Celeste. On his desk was a complete confession, detailing every aspect of his obsession and his gradually escalating plans to isolate and control the woman he claimed to love. But even in death, Dr. Hartwell had managed to maintain some of his deception. The detective's trained eye caught several inconsistencies in the suicide note and confession, details that suggested the doctor's death might not have been as voluntary as it appeared. The case was far from closed, and the detective suspected that Dr. Hartwell's obsession had made him as much a victim as a perpetrator in this deadly symphony of murder and madness. Chapter 8. The Final Movement. The discovery of Dr. Hartwell's apparent suicide should have brought closure to the case, but the detective's instincts told him that crucial questions remained unanswered. As he examined the scene in the doctor's study, several details troubled him. The positioning of the body seemed too neat, too carefully arranged. The glass that had contained the poison showed no fingerprints, unusual for someone drinking their final dose. Most tellingly, the confession was written in handwriting that, while similar to Dr. Hartwell's, showed subtle differences suggesting it might have been forged. "Inspector Morrison," the detective said quietly, "I believe we may be looking at a third murder disguised as suicide." Morrison examined the scene more carefully. But who would want Dr. Hartwell dead? And how did they know about his obsession with Celeste? The answer came as they discovered a hidden surveillance system in Dr. Hartwell's house. Someone had been watching the doctor just as carefully as he had been watching Celeste. The cameras revealed that Dr. Hartwell had received a visitor on the evening of his death, someone whose face was carefully obscured, but whose movements suggested familiarity with the house's layout. More importantly, the surveillance footage from the night of Victoria Sterling's death showed something that changed everything. The timestamp indicated that Dr. Hartwell had been at home, working on his confession, at the exact time Victoria was supposedly murdered on Westminster Bridge. Someone else killed Victoria, the detective concluded. Someone who wanted us to believe Dr. Hartwell was responsible for both murders. The realization that they were dealing with a fourth participant in this deadly game sent them back to examine all their previous assumptions. If Dr. Hartwell hadn't killed Victoria, then someone else had known about his obsession and used it to cover their own crimes. The detective returned to Celeste's apartment, this time examining it with fresh eyes. The music box that Dr. Hartwell had mentioned in his supposed suicide note drew his attention. Hidden in its base was indeed additional evidence, but not what they had expected. Instead of proof of Dr. Hartwell's guilt, they found a collection of photographs showing the doctor's surveillance activities. Someone had been documenting his obsession, gathering evidence of his gradual poisoning scheme. The photographs were professionally taken, suggesting someone with significant resources and patience. Someone was watching the watcher, Morrison observed, but the most revealing discovery came in the form of a small recording device hidden in Celeste's bedroom. When played back, it contained conversations between Celeste and Victoria from the weeks before the violinist's death. The conversations revealed that both women had become aware of Dr. Hartwell's obsession much earlier than anyone had suspected. They had been working together to gather evidence of his activities, planning to confront him legally rather than allowing his behavior to continue. But more shocking was what the recording revealed about Victoria's true relationship with Celeste. The two women weren't just professional associates. They had been romantically involved for over 5 years, keeping their relationship secret to protect both their careers and Celeste's public image. "She was going to leave everything to me," Victoria's voice said on the recording. "Her money, her instruments, her entire estate. We were going to retire together, maybe move to France where we could live openly." The detective felt pieces of the puzzle shifting into new configurations. If Victoria had been Celeste's secret partner and primary beneficiary, her death after Celeste's would ensure that the inheritance would pass to someone else entirely. They found their answer in Celeste's will, discovered in her lawyer's safe. The document revealed that, if Victoria predeceased her or died within 30 days of Celeste's death, the entire estate would pass to Celeste's only living relative, a nephew she hadn't seen in 20 years. Marcus Chen had never mentioned being related to Celeste Fontaine. The stage manager's personnel file at the Royal Opera House contained falsified documents. His real name was Marcus Fontaine Chen, Celeste's sister's son, who had been estranged from the family after a bitter dispute over money 2 decades earlier. He knew about Victoria and Celeste's relationship, the detective explained as they prepared to make their final arrest. He had been watching them, waiting for the right opportunity. When Dr. Hartwell's obsession provided the perfect cover, Marcus saw his chance. The evidence was overwhelming once they knew where to look. Marcus had access to every part of the theatre, knew Celeste's routines intimately, and could move about the building without attracting attention. He had allowed Dr. Hartwell's gradual poisoning to proceed, while planning his own more direct intervention. On the night of the concert, Marcus had applied the final lethal dose of poison to Celeste's rosin, ensuring her death during the performance. He had then killed Victoria to prevent her from inheriting, and finally murdered Dr. Hartwell to close the circle of evidence. They found Marcus at the theatre, calmly preparing for that evening's performance as if nothing had happened. His only reaction upon seeing them was a slight smile. "I wondered how long it would take you to figure it out," he said quietly. "The Belgian detective has quite a reputation." "Why, Marcus?" Morrison asked. "Why kill your own aunt?" Marcus's expression hardened. "She cut our family off 20 years ago over a petty disagreement about my father's debts. My mother died in poverty while Celeste lived in luxury. She owed us, and she refused to pay. So you waited 20 years for revenge. I waited 20 years for justice. When I learned about her relationship with Victoria, I realized I would never see a penny of what should have been family money. Victoria would have gotten everything, and our family would have remained forgotten." The detective studied Marcus with a mixture of sadness and revulsion. "And Dr. Hartwell, he was an innocent man despite his obsession." "Innocent?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "He was slowly killing her anyway. I just expedited the process, and he provided the perfect cover for what needed to be done." As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, the detective reflected on the terrible irony of the case. 3 people had died because of secrets and obsessions that had festered in darkness for years. If Celeste and Victoria had been able to live openly, if Dr. Hartwell had sought help for his disturbing fixation, if Marcus had found a way to reconcile with his aunt, perhaps none of this tragedy would have occurred. But such speculation was pointless now. The music had ended. The players had taken their final bows, and all that remained was the echo of Celeste's last haunting note. Chapter 9. Revelations in the Wings. With Marcus Chen in custody, the detective should have felt the satisfaction of a case solved. But something continued to nag at him. The meticulous nature of the planning, the sophisticated understanding of both poisons and human psychology, seemed beyond what a stage manager, even a bitter, intelligent one, could have orchestrated alone. Inspector Morrison shared these concerns as they reviewed the evidence in the theatre's administrative office. Marcus had access and motive, Morrison admitted, but some of these details, the gradual poisoning schedule, the psychological manipulation of Dr. Hartwell, the precise timing of everything, it feels like there was someone else involved. The detective nodded thoughtfully. Marcus has confessed to being present when each murder was committed, but confessions can be as misleading as denials. Let us examine what we know with fresh eyes. They had been assuming that Marcus acted alone, using Dr. Hartwell's obsession as convenient cover. But what if the relationship between the two men was more complex? What if they had been working together from the beginning? This possibility led them to examine Dr. Hartwell's patient records more carefully. Hidden among his files was a consultation record for a M. Chen, dating back over a year, long before Celeste's symptoms had begun. The medical notes revealed that Marcus had sought treatment for what he described as intrusive thoughts about revenge and obsessive planning behaviors. Dr. Hartwell had prescribed medication and therapy, but more significantly, the two men had formed what the doctor described as a therapeutic alliance based on shared experiences of rejection and abandonment. They bonded over their mutual resentment, the detective realized. Dr. Hartwell felt rejected by Celeste romantically, while Marcus felt abandoned by his family. The doctor didn't just provide psychological cover for the murders, he was an active participant in planning them. This revelation recast everything they thought they knew about the case. Dr. Hartwell's suicide now appeared to be exactly what it seemed, the final act of a man consumed by guilt and obsession. But his death had been planned from the beginning as a way to close the circle of evidence. Further investigation revealed the true sophistication of their scheme. Dr. Hartwell had used his medical knowledge to design the gradual poisoning protocol, while Marcus had provided access and opportunity. Together, they had created a plan that would eliminate not just Celeste and Victoria, but eventually Dr. Hartwell himself, leaving Marcus as the sole survivor and beneficiary. Surveillance equipment found in Dr. Hartwell's house hadn't been installed by an unknown third party. Marcus had placed it there to ensure the doctor followed their agreed-upon timeline. The photographs documenting Dr. Hartwell's obsession weren't evidence against him, but rather an insurance policy to ensure his cooperation. Marcus was always the dominant partner in this relationship, the detective explained to Morrison. He manipulated Dr. Hartwell's genuine mental illness, feeding his obsessions while directing them toward their shared goal. The recording device in Celeste's bedroom provided additional confirmation. The conversations between Celeste and Victoria about Dr. Hartwell's behavior hadn't been discovered accidentally. Marcus had planted the device specifically to monitor their growing awareness of the threat. But the most chilling discovery came when they examined the sheet music from Celeste's final performance more carefully. The mysterious numbers penciled in the margins, 4, 7, 12, 15, weren't random markings or measure indicators. They were a code. When applied to the alphabet, A1, B2, and so on, the numbers spelled out a message. D, G, L, O. At first, this seemed meaningless. But when read as musical notes, they formed a chord progression, a harmonic sequence that Marcus would have recognized immediately as a family melody his aunt used to play when he was a child. He was taunting her, the detective said grimly. Even in her final moments, he wanted her to know who was responsible and why. The realization that Marcus had been psychologically torturing Celeste during her final performance added a layer of cruelty to the crimes that went beyond simple murder. He had turned her art, her greatest source of joy and pride, into an instrument of terror and revenge. When confronted with this new evidence, Marcus's composure finally cracked. Gone was the calm acceptance he had shown during his initial arrest. Faced with proof of the elaborate psychological manipulation he had orchestrated, he became agitated and defensive. "She deserved to know," he said, his voice rising. "She deserved to understand that her selfishness had consequences. All those years of living in luxury while my mother struggled, while our family fell apart, she needed to pay for that." "And Dr. Hartwell?" Morrison pressed. "Did he deserve to die for trying to help you?" Marcus's expression grew cold again. He was weak, useful for a time, but ultimately weak. He would have confessed eventually, ruined everything. His death was necessary. The detective observed Marcus carefully, noting the complete absence of remorse or empathy in his demeanor. This wasn't just a case of revenge driven by family resentment. They were dealing with someone whose capacity for human connection had been fundamentally damaged. As the interrogation continued, more details of the elaborate scheme emerged. Marcus and Dr. Hartwell had been planning Celeste's murder for over a year, carefully studying her habits, her relationships, her fears. They had manipulated Elena Vasquez's insecurity, exploited Sir Reginald's infatuation, and used James Whitmore's financial troubles as additional layers of misdirection. But perhaps most disturbing was the revelation that they had considered other potential victims as well. Dr. Hartwell's files contained preliminary plans for eliminating several other prominent musicians who had rejected his professional advances over the years. Celeste wasn't the end of this, the detective realized. She was just the beginning. If they had succeeded completely, there would have been others. The scope of the conspiracy was broader and more dangerous than anyone had imagined, and the detective knew that Marcus Chen's arrest, while satisfying, represented only the conclusion of one chapter in what could have become a much larger and more deadly story. Chapter 10. Coda. 6 months after the arrest of Marcus Chen, the Royal Opera House had returned to its normal rhythms, though the memory of that terrible evening lingered in the ornate halls and backstage corridors. The detective sat in the same box where he had first observed the tragedy unfold, this time watching a memorial concert dedicated to Celeste Fontaine's memory. Elena Vasquez stood where Celeste had once performed, playing the same Paganini caprice with technical precision and growing emotional depth. The young violinist had been cleared of all suspicion and had, in the months following the tragedy, begun to develop the very qualities Celeste had found lacking: emotional maturity and genuine artistic vision. Sir Reginald Ashworth, his grief for Celeste having evolved into a determination to honour her memory, had established a foundation for young musicians. James Whitmore, freed from both suspicion and the burden of his secret guilt, had found peace in teaching and had become the Foundation's first musical director. The detective reflected on the complex web of relationships and motivations that had led to such tragedy. Marcus Chen's trial had revealed the full extent of his psychological manipulation, not just of Dr. Hartwell, but of everyone in Celeste's orbit. He had been sentenced to life imprisonment, showing no remorse even in his final statement to the court. Dr. Hartwell's story had proven more complex and tragic. Subsequent investigation revealed a history of mental illness dating back to his medical school years, exacerbated by a series of professional and personal failures that had gradually eroded his grasp on appropriate boundaries. His manipulation by Marcus had preyed upon genuine psychological vulnerabilities, making him as much a victim as a perpetrator. The detective had testified at length about the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy, emphasizing how Marcus had exploited not just Dr. Hartwell's illness, but the natural human emotions of everyone around Celeste: Elena's ambition, Sir Reginald's loneliness, James's desperation, Victoria's protective love. Victoria Sterling's memorial service had been held the week before, attended by hundreds of people from the music world who had been unaware of her relationship with Celeste. The detective had spoken with her family, who had known about and quietly supported the relationship for years. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that Victoria had died trying to protect the woman she loved. As Elena concluded the Paganini piece with a flourish that would have made her teacher proud, the detective thought about the nature of obsession and revenge. Marcus's 20-year quest for what he called justice had destroyed not only his intended targets, but himself as well. His inheritance of Celeste's estate had been voided by his conviction, the money instead going to various musical charities. A final irony that would have amused Celeste. The memorial concert concluded with a performance of Debussy's Clair de Lune, the piece Celeste had been playing when she died. But this time the music reached its natural conclusion, the final notes floating through the theatre with the peace and beauty the composer had intended. Inspector Morrison joined the detective in his box as the audience began to file out. "Any regrets about how it all unfolded?" he asked. The detective considered the question carefully. "I regret that we did not see the full scope of the conspiracy sooner. Perhaps, if we had understood Marcus's role earlier, Dr. Hartwell might have been saved. Perhaps Victoria might still be alive." "But you solved an impossible case," Morrison pointed out. 3 murders disguised as one, with enough false leads and misdirection to confuse anyone. "Oui, but at what cost?" The detective stood, straightening his coat. "The music world has lost a great artist, and several lives have been destroyed by secrets that should have been brought to light years ago." As they made their way out of the theatre, the detective reflected on the lessons of the case. Celeste Fontaine's murder had been solved not through brilliant deduction alone, but through patient observation of human nature, the way people behave when driven by love, hate, fear, and desperation. The case had also demonstrated how modern forensic techniques could be combined with traditional detective work to unravel even the most complex conspiracies. The surveillance footage, chemical analysis, and digital evidence had been crucial in establishing the timeline and methods of the murders. But perhaps most importantly, the case had shown how dangerous it could be when mental illness was exploited by those with malicious intent. Dr. Hartwell's psychological vulnerabilities had been weaponized by Marcus, turning the doctor's illness into an instrument of murder. A year later, the detective would receive a letter from Elena Vasquez, now performing with major orchestras around the world. She wrote to thank him for clearing her name, but also to share something she had discovered while going through some of Celeste's papers that had been donated to a music library. Hidden in one of Celeste's journals was an entry written just days before her death. "I fear I have been blind to danger close to home. If something should happen to me, look carefully at those who claim to love me. Sometimes love can be the most dangerous emotion of all." Celeste had sensed the threat, had perhaps even suspected its source, but had not lived long enough to act on her intuitions. It was a final reminder that even the most perceptive among us can fall victim to those who hide their malice behind masks of affection and family loyalty. The detective kept that letter as a reminder of the case that had challenged him most deeply, not because of its complexity, but because of the very human tragedies that lay at its heart. In the end, the violinist's last note would be remembered not just as a brilliant musical performance cut short, but as a cautionary tale about the deadly consequences of secrets, obsession, and revenge. The music had ended, but its echoes would linger in the memory of all who had witnessed its tragic final movement. Thus concludes our tale, dear listeners of Cozy Mysteries. Until next time, this has been Stephen, reminding you that sometimes the most beautiful melodies can hide the darkest of intentions.